The Greek play in our department is such an important feature of the department life. It's been running for decades, and in that time it has always been produced in the Bloomsbury Theatre just across the road from Gordon House, where Greek and Latin resides. And the Bloomsbury Theatre is very much, has the feel of the West End theatre in its layout and in the scale of the audience that you can get. So in any one year we expect audiences of up to 2,000 people to come and see the show. And what makes the play so exciting for us is that it's an opportunity for students to engage with staff in terms of the academic advice and the research expertise that we can offer on the history of Greek drama, but also an engagement with practitioners, with theatre directors, an opportunity to put on workshops, to give talks, to bring in audiences from schools, from amateur dramatic societies, to reach an audience much bigger than simply the students in our department.
I'm Laura Swift from the UCL Department of Greek and Latin, and I'm here to talk to Russell Bender, who's a professional theatre director who's been doing some work with us for our Greek play this year, the Hippolytus. And so, Russell, perhaps you could start by talking briefly a bit about what role ancient drama has played in your training and in your work as a director.
I trained at a school in Paris called École Jacques Lecoq, which was founded by a French theatre maker, director, movement director called Jacques Lecoq. The base of the school is very physical, and it's very much about going really back to the basics of what theatre is and trying to build up our understanding based on that. He was very influenced by all forms of early theatre, and particularly Greek theatre, in his training and in his work. And I guess the two biggest areas that manifests itself in are you do a lot of work with masks and trying to understand how a mask can play and what you can do with it. And you do a lot of work on choruses, in particular on tragic choruses. Filling up the space between us. What I mean by that is if everyone stops, what I mean by that is were we to stop right now, we'll plump over there, there's quite a lot of space over here. So that we're always taking responsibility between us to try and keep the space as evenly populated as possible. Does that make sense? So off we go. And to make this work, I think the thing that attracted him to ancient theatre and ancient choruses are the incredibly high stakes of things that are going on, the incredible kind of sense of tension you get from the words. The fact that you've got something that is rhythmic and that is poetic, and rhythm and movement immediately start to ally, because movement tends to have a rhythm to it, and rhythm tends to suggest movement, and that's where dance comes from. And obviously that was a part of the original staging of choruses. So he was very interested in using poetic rhythmic text.
The workshop you're doing for us today, in fact, is on the chorus. So maybe you could tell us a bit about what you're planning to do with that.
The things I want to look at are how do you start to work with a body of people who become more than the sum of its parts, who become more than just a collection of individuals. How does that move? How can you move as a part of that? What theatrical potential does that start to suggest? And how can that speak? And what is the voice? What happens when a chorus speaks in unison, or what other ways can it start to speak? So we're just going to start at looking at those two questions, and hopefully, I suspect it will. I don't think we'll be having beautifully polished choruses by the end of it, but I hope that we'll just start to scratch the surface of that. Whereas this feels like a... So I guess the question is, that's two things. That's the pulse of the rhythm, and then that sense of a tension of spreading over the skin, which suddenly falls apart, comes back in. Lecoq himself approached this by going back to basics and trying to work out how a chorus works by the basic rules. So he started building up a chorus of 2 people or 3 people and seeing whether it functioned. And the conclusion he reached was that there were 2 different numbers of that function, which are 7 or 15 people.
Mm-hmm. That's very interesting to me as an academic, because 15 is the number that scholars think became the original number for the ancient chorus, certainly by the middle of the 5th century. So why did Lecoq think that worked? What was it that the Greeks managed to settle on that was so good about this number?
I think it's a fundamental thing to do with the behaviour of people in space and the way that changes with different numbers of people. So he started off with, obviously 2 people can't be a chorus, it's just a dialogue. 3 people, the dynamics of how that works essentially can't escape from being a triangle. It never really becomes anything more than that. Most of the even numbers don't work. 4 just becomes a square, 6, 8, they just don't quite... There's something about an odd number that introduces more potential in the dynamics of people moving. And so 5 kind of works not particularly well. 7 is the first number that really does have a lot of different possibilities and dynamics. And then the next one that's really satisfying is 15, which either functions very, very well as a body of its own, or can split into 2 subchoruses of 7 with 1 sort of leader.
You mentioned that the chorus can be quite an alien thing for a modern audience or director. I mean, how have you got around that in your own work as a director? What do you think are good ways to stage the chorus?
So when you first told me that chorus was something that existed outside of theatre, in fact before theatre, and that was a part of Greek culture and society, that very much changed the way I thought about it. The idea of it being ritual is definitely a way in. It's a complicated way in because we're not a very ritual society. The other way in is to try and think about where we have where we have that idea of lots of different voices of a whole in our society. When the chorus maybe doesn't become something so literally on stage in front of you, but still becomes the sense of something of many voices that are more than the sum of their parts.
And I'd like you to come up with a sequence of things that happen that you're responding to. And in that, I'm going to set a few constraints that I want to see. I'd like to see a moment of you all reacting as individuals to something you see. So it might be, to take a football match example, it might be a bad decision by the ref, and you're like, oh, I can't believe what is this? A moment where you all react absolutely in unison to something. So I mean, that could obviously be a goal in a football match. A moment where you all speak in unison, and a moment where you all move in unison, which could be a surge forward of a pitch invasion, it could be rising up in a cheer.
Something that struck me was watching things like the New Zealand rugby team's haka that they perform at the start of matches as a kind of choral performance, that is both authentic and musical and culturally true, but obviously to nowadays to only a small group of people in a very specific context.
The other really strong connection we've got is with ancient chorus is the idea of music, and what that music is. It's totally different, I'm sure, but using song and music and rhythm.
So perhaps it's more like the experience of being in a choir is for a modern person, in that if one is in a choir, one doesn't expect to have an individual role or persona within that choir, but what you're doing is participating in a group performance.
As you're breathing in, go up a little bit. As you're breathing out, you're shrinking a little bit. And try and imagine that between you, you are creating one breath rather than 2 or 3 individual breaths.
Something I find interesting about the chorus, from an academic perspective, is the way that it hovers between being a group of characters within the world of the play, yet also being a chorus and as such separate from the world of the play, and having perhaps access to these deeper ritual truths that the other characters aren't able to claim. And how do you manage to square that circle in when you're working with the chorus? To what extent are they supposed to be characters embedded in the action rather than something?
I think there's a great joy to find in squaring that circle, as you put it. I think there's something very, very beautiful in the moment when a group of individuals becomes something more than that, and when it disintegrates back into a group of individuals. And in fact, one of the kind of key things you learn when trying to do the chorus at Le Coq is you start off with everyone very much doing the same thing, and it frankly can be a little bit boring. And where it starts to lift off is when you manage to get the many different reactions to a same thing that still feel part of a whole. When the chorus has a dynamic, but that dynamic is achieved through everyone being slightly different.
Perhaps that lack of ritual emotion makes it harder for a modern audience to relate to the chorus. That I get the impression that sometimes we can find it a little bit embarrassing, the idea of having a group of people singing and dancing, and because it's so alien to the way that we actually celebrate or commemorate anything nowadays.
One of the things you explore in Le Coq is that moment when for example, you've got a random group of passers-by and a fight breaks out in the street, and suddenly strangers united by something that they're observing. There's a lot of rich potential in that.
I suppose that fits with the idea that in ancient tragedies the chorus are characterised by something very crude, so there'll be, as in Hippolytus, women of Troezen who happens to have overheard Phaedra crying. I suppose that idea of a response to a particular situation, and that creates a crowd environment where when one previously didn't exist. And how do you see the interface between the work you do as a theatre practitioner and the kind of academic work that people like me do, looking at the chorus from a scholarly perspective?
I think it's an extremely valuable interface, and I think it has the potential to be a two-way interface. I think from my point of view, first and foremost, having access to an academic perspective on Greek theatre in its broadest sense is really valuable, because it gives me the context with which to work. Because most of these plays are amazing plays, but a lot of the meaning is obscured by changes in society, because my job essentially is to start with to get inside the writer's head and to try and understand exactly what they're doing. So anything that gives me a context and understanding of that, an understanding of what a chorus might have been, rather than just letting me respond in my own modern way to an ancient text, just gives it more depth, gives it more richness, helps me do my job. It would be very interesting to have opportunities for theatre makers who are experts in the arc of a story and these things, to share their knowledge with academics and see if that leads to a two-way thing rather than just a one-way thing.